The overhead lights in the Caldwell Parish substation buzzed at a frequency that got into your teeth if you sat under them long enough, and Claire Thibodeaux had been sitting under them for 41 minutes. She'd counted. Not because she was anxious. She counted because it was what her mind did in rooms like this, cataloged, filed, measured the small details that most people let slide past them. The water stain on the drop ceiling that looked like the boot of Italy. The laminate peeling at the corner of the booking desk where someone had picked at it long enough to expose the gray particle board beneath. The deputy by the door, young, maybe 24, uncomfortable with his role tonight, who kept shifting his weight from his right boot to his left and back again in an 8-second cycle. She had set her hands flat on the table after the second time they'd asked her to, not because they had the right to ask, because she'd let them. Outside, through the single window set high in the cinder block wall, the August heat was still working even at 9:40 in the evening. She could hear it in the way insects sang against the glass, the way the air conditioner in the corner unit rattled and groaned like something dying slowly. Caldwell Parish sat in a low pocket of central Louisiana where the land couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be bayou or pine flat, and the result was a kind of damp, indeterminate misery that clung to everything: the buildings, the people, the air itself. Spanish moss hung off the live oaks lining the highway like old laundry. Everything here felt like it had been left out too long. The deputy shifted, left boot. Claire moved her gaze to the door. 7 weeks earlier, she had driven into Caldwell Parish in a 2017 Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper and Mississippi plates, a lease arranged through a forwarding address in Natchez that would hold up to anything short of a federal background check. She'd rented a room above the hardware store on Delahousie Street from a woman named Mrs. Arsenault who asked no questions because she needed the $420 a month, and because Claire had given off an energy, she told people later, of someone who had simply run out of somewhere else to be. She'd gotten a job 3 days later at the Pelican Diner on Highway 19, the kind of place with vinyl-upholstered stools at the counter and a pie case that turned slowly in a refrigerated display and a coffee that came from a commercial maker that had not been descaled since the Obama administration. She waitressed the breakfast and lunch shifts. She smiled when she needed to. She tipped the cook well, a man named Darnell who had a daughter in Baton Rouge and gout in his left foot and who appreciated the gesture without making a ceremony of it. She'd been assigned to this operation after 18 months on a task force working financial crimes out of the New Orleans field office, and before that, 3 years in Washington on an interstate trafficking matter that had ended in 16 federal indictments and 1 jury acquittal that still bothered her when she thought about it. She was 37. She'd been in the bureau for 11 years. She had never once in those 11 years fired her service weapon at a human being, a fact she neither advertised nor felt the need to examine publicly. The assignment to Caldwell Parish had come through the Criminal Investigative Division, referred by the Louisiana State Police after an internal affairs complaint from a former deputy. Complaint since withdrawn, the complainant since relocated pointed at a pattern of asset seizures, evidence mishandling, and at least 3 suspected frame-ups involving narcotics charges over an 18-month period. The subjects of those charges had 2 things in common. They were poor, and they had in some way inconvenienced a senior deputy named Dale Murchison. The intelligence package on Murchison was 38 pages. Claire had read it twice on the plane from Dulles and once more in the parking lot of a Buc-ee's outside Lafayette before driving the last 40 miles into the parish. The photograph in the file showed a man in his late 40s, barrel-chested, with the kind of sun-damaged complexion that came from years working outdoors before years working indoors. He had a wide flat face, pale blue eyes, and a gray mustache that he kept trimmed in a way that suggested he still cared about how he looked in the mirror. He'd been with the Caldwell Parish Sheriff's Office for 22 years. He coached youth league football. He attended St. Ignatius on Sunday mornings. He owned a bass boat he kept on a trailer behind his house on Bayou Buff Road and a second property, a hunting camp registered to an LLC that had generated a notable amount of interest from the Financial Crimes Unit once they'd looked at his disclosed income. The file noted that Murchison was not a dumb man. Several people interviewed, including his former partner who now worked for a security firm in Shreveport, had described him as sharp. The word came up in 3 separate interviews: careful, methodical. What he was not, those interviews also suggested, was good at being wrong. She'd made contact with him on a Thursday, which was the day he worked a half shift at the substation and then came to the Pelican for a late breakfast. He sat at the counter. He ordered the same thing every time: 2 eggs over easy, link sausage, white toast, and decaf coffee, because his wife had made him switch after his blood pressure spiked 2 years ago. He left $1.50 on the counter whether the ticket was $6 or $12. Claire had taken his order that first Thursday without introducing herself. She'd refilled his coffee when he held the mug out without looking at her. She'd brought the check without being asked. He hadn't looked at her face until the 4th Thursday. By the 6th, he was talking to her, not aggressively, nothing overt. Men like Murchison didn't work that way. They tested first, the way you'd test ice before putting your weight on it. A question about where she was from, an observation about the heat. A comment about the diner delivered with a rueful smile that was both a criticism and an invitation to agree. She'd agreed. She told him she was from Gulfport, that she'd come up here after a bad situation she didn't want to get into. She let the vagueness of that hang there, let him fill in whatever picture he wanted. She could tell he filled it in the way men like him usually did: a boyfriend, maybe, or a husband. Something she'd had to run from, something that left her grateful to be somewhere quiet where someone in authority was friendly to her. That was the picture she needed him to have. The actual work of the operation was largely unglamorous and largely administrative. Her contact at the field office was an agent named Marcus Webb, who called a burn phone she kept in the glove compartment every Tuesday and Thursday. Her field reports were transmitted via a secure app that looked on the surface like a recipe-sharing platform. She had a second phone, her civilian phone, the one she carried visibly, that had a Spotify account and a Facebook page with a modest history and 31 friends who were either bureau support staff or accounts maintained for exactly this kind of deployment. She took photographs when the opportunity existed and was safe. She documented Murchison's routine. She noted who came to see him during the shifts when she could observe the substation parking lot from the diner's back window, which afforded a partial sightline to the lot's east half. She noted the silver F-250 that appeared there on alternating Mondays, registered to a farm supply business that had no apparent relationship to the sheriff's department. She noted when Murchison left his shift early. She noted his body language when he returned. She also began quietly to talk to people. Not directly about Murchison, about the parish, about what it was like to live here, about the things that made people leave and the things that kept them. At the diner, she had the natural advantage of invisibility. People talked across the counter with the particular freedom that comes from speaking to someone who is serving you, someone whose job requires them to smile. She heard about Terrence Duplessis, 26, who was doing 18 months in Caldwell Parish Correctional on a distribution charge that his mother, a housekeeper named Lavinia, maintained had been built entirely from evidence she didn't believe existed before her son was stopped on the Bayou Buff Road one night. She heard about a woman named Sandra Gaudo, whose trailer had been searched the previous fall following an anonymous tip, and who had found, during that search, a Ziploc bag of methamphetamine in her bathroom cabinet that she was absolutely certain she had not put there, and who had accepted a plea because she had 3 children and a court-appointed attorney who had 16 other cases that month and who had told her plainly that going to trial against a law enforcement officer in Caldwell Parish was a mathematics problem she wasn't going to solve. Sandra was 41. She'd worked at the Dollar General on Route 9. She'd lost that job after the arrest. She was working nights now at a catfish processing plant 20 miles east, driving a car that needed 2 new tires and raising her 3 children with the residual shame that attached itself to a drug charge in a small parish the way mud attached itself to boots permanently in the creases. Claire had eaten pie with Sandra twice. She had not told Sandra who she was. She hadn't promised her anything. That was the part of this work she'd never found a way to make peace with. The evening of August 15th began with a noise complaint. This was, in retrospect, where Murchison made his first mistake, not the largest, not the final, but the first one that mattered. He'd been assigned the evening shift, which he'd swapped from a younger deputy named Fontenville as a personal favor. He'd wanted to be working on this particular evening, which itself was a detail that agents reviewing the body camera footage later would note in their reports. Claire had been in her car, a block and a half from the Pelican, engine running, reviewing notes on her secondary phone. She'd stayed late to help Darnell with a delivery that had come in wrong, 40 cases of soup cans that needed to be counted and stacked before the walk-in shelving could be reconfigured. She was tired in the way you got tired from physical work, a different tired than the work of maintaining a character for weeks, a more honest kind of tired. She had the radio on low. A country station out of Alexandria was playing something she half recognized. The tap on her driver's window arrived without preamble. She turned her head at normal speed, not fast, not slow. Murchison was standing at the window in full uniform, his hat on, his face in partial shadow from the parking lot light behind him. His expression was neutral, practiced neutral, not naturally neutral, the look of a man who had decided something before he'd walked up to the car. She put the window down. "Evening," he said. "Hey," she said. "You waiting on somebody?" She looked at him the way she'd calibrated to look at him over the preceding weeks, slightly differential, slightly uncertain, the posture of a woman who'd learned to be careful around authority without being combative about it. Not afraid, just experienced. "No," she said, "just sitting radio." He looked into the car. His flashlight crossed the dash, the back seat, her bag on the passenger floor. She'd left the secondary phone visible, screen down next to the bag, the civilian phone. "You got any ID on you?" She gave him the Louisiana driver's license that had been prepared for this deployment. Claire Ann Thibodeaux, DOB November 3, 1987. The address was a real apartment in a real building in Shreveport where a support contract meant the name appeared correctly on the mailbox roll. He looked at it for a moment longer than necessary. "You mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" She looked at him. "Why?" "Just routine." Neither of them believed that, neither of them said so. She got out of the car. He ran her license through dispatch. She could hear the crackle of the return from his shoulder radio, no wants, no warrants, no priors. She watched his face when it came through, the neutral expression didn't shift. "You been drinking tonight?" "No." "You seem a little off." "I've been working all day, I'm tired." "Where do you work?" "Pelican Diner up the street." He knew where she worked. He'd been eating there for 6 weeks. He was testing something, what she'd volunteer, whether she'd use their acquaintance, whether she'd say, "You know where I work, Dale," and give him something he could use. She didn't. Anybody who can verify that. Darnell's still inside if the dock light's on. He looked in the direction of the diner without moving, then he looked back at her. "I'm going to need to search the vehicle." "On what grounds?" The question wasn't aggressive, it was flat, matter of fact, the way you'd ask what time a store closed. Something moved in his eyes, not anger, not quite, closer to recalibration. She'd surprised him by asking. He'd expected the kind of compliance that came from exhaustion, from resignation, from someone who'd been through enough to know that fighting back cost more than giving in. "There's a smell coming from the vehicle," he said. "I can't consent to a search," she said. "I'm sorry." The "I'm sorry" was important, she'd practiced that, the apology that offered nothing. He looked at her for a moment. She held his gaze without challenge, without submission, just steadily, the way you might look at a map to fix your location. He reached for his radio. The backup was a deputy named Trosclair who arrived in 9 minutes and parked his unit nose-to-nose with Claire's Civic, which meant there were now 2 sets of headlights painting her white in the parking lot as the night traffic on Highway 19 drifted past at 20 miles over the limit without slowing. She stood beside her car with her arms at her sides, not crossed. She'd learned that crossed arms looked defensive on body camera footage, and there were 2 body cameras running now, Murchison's and Trosclair's, both angled at her. Murchison told Trosclair he had reasonable suspicion based on the smell. Trosclair, who was 29 and had been with the department for 3 years, and who would later tell federal investigators that he'd had reservations about the stop from the beginning but had not felt positioned to say so, asked if Murchison wanted him to run the K9. "K9's at the barn," Murchison said. "We'll do the walk around." They made her stand in the cone of the headlights while they searched the car. She watched them work and kept her face careful and still. Her service weapon was in a lockbox in the trunk space beneath the spare tire. The lockbox itself was covered by the tire and a piece of cut carpet and would not be visible unless someone deliberately removed the tire. Her credentials were in a false bottom of the lockbox, not because she was embarrassed by them, but because an undercover operative whose FBI credentials were found in a roadside search was an operative whose 18-week deployment was over and whose network of developing informant relationships had just been fed into a shredder. They found the bag under the passenger seat. She heard Murchison say, "There it is," in a voice that was calibrated to sound like discovery and landed to her ear like confirmation. The bag was a quart-sized Ziploc, sealed, containing a compressed white substance consistent with, she would later review the evidence inventory, which would note it as 8.3 grams of methamphetamine. She looked at the bag in Murchison's gloved hand. She looked at his face. He was watching her the way a man watches a door he expects to open. "That yours?" he said. She said no. The arrest itself was brief and procedurally clean, which would also be noted later by the federal investigators who reviewed the video. Murchison was careful. He read her Miranda without rushing it, without stumbling over the words, because he'd read it enough times that it had the cadence of something memorized in childhood, like the Pledge of Allegiance or the Act of Contrition. He handled her with professionalism, no roughness, no drama. He told her she could call someone from the substation. He filled out the booking paperwork himself rather than having Trosclair do it, and he did it without errors, which was also noted. He was, in the language of the later reports, operating as though he expected this to go to court and expected to win. What he had not done at any point in the 18-week duration of their acquaintance was run a real background check. He'd run the name, the license had returned clean. He'd asked around, loosely, her story about Gulfport, the bad situation, the arriving with nothing narrative. He'd verified, through the kind of informal check that relied on his own instincts and experience, that Claire Thibodeaux was exactly what she presented. A woman without resources, without connection, without leverage. Someone who would roll into the Caldwell Parish legal system like a marble into a cup, sit in the jail for a week or two, take whatever plea came across the desk, and exit the parish within 60 days, one more data point in the ongoing story of women who passed through small southern towns and disappeared. He'd been reading People for 22 years. He was not wrong often. She was processed at the substation. She sat in the chair and let the young Deputy Fontenville, she learned now from the nameplate, the one who'd traded shifts, take her fingerprints. He was apologetic in a way he was trying to conceal. He pressed her fingers to the scanner with a gentleness that felt like guilt. She was moved to the holding cell at 11:15. The cell had two other occupants, a woman in her 50s who was asleep against the wall with her arms folded over her chest like she'd been here before and had found her preferred position, and a younger woman, early 20s, who sat on the opposite bench and stared at the floor and occasionally picked at the skin around her thumbnail. Claire sat down on the center bench. She put her back against the wall. The younger woman looked up. She had dark circles and the careful stillness of someone who was holding herself together with an effort that was costing her. "You okay?" the woman said. "Yeah," Claire said. The woman nodded. She looked back at the floor. "They planted on you." Claire looked at her. "You've got the look," the woman said, not unkindly. "What look?" "Like you knew it was there before they found it." Claire said nothing to that. The woman went back to picking at her thumbnail. The sleeping woman shifted and resettled. Somewhere in the building, a door banged shut and the overhead light flickered once. The call she was permitted to make at 11:58 was to a number she'd memorized. The number rang twice and was answered by a man who identified himself as her brother and who said yes, he'd come first thing in the morning. She said that was fine. She said she was all right. She said to tell their mother not to worry. The man on the other end of the line was Marcus Webb, 6 hours away in the New Orleans field office, who had been the duty agent on her contact number, and who had now moved from his desk to the elevator to the secure operations floor, where he would spend the next 90 minutes on the phone with his supervisor, and with the deputy special agent in charge, and with a federal prosecutor in the Western District of Louisiana, who had a standing interest in the Caldwell Parish matter. Webb had been in this work for 14 years. He was not a man who panicked, but he'd noted in the call a particular quality to her voice, not distress exactly, more like the focused calm of someone who has just watched an operation accelerate from her own control into a phase where the physics of it take over. He'd heard that in her voice before once during the New Orleans operation, and it had meant that whatever came next was going to move fast. He'd been right then. Dale Murchison left the substation at 12:40. He drove his personal vehicle, a gray Chevy Tahoe, to a property on Bayou Buff Road and sat in the driveway for 11 minutes with the engine off. There was a motion-activated camera and a fake utility box on a telephone pole 40 feet east of the driveway, installed under a court order obtained 17 days earlier, and it recorded him sitting in the dark car, which he did sometimes when he needed to think. What he was thinking, as the investigators would later construct from records and his own eventual testimony, was that he'd been impulsive. He'd wanted her out of the way. She'd started asking questions, nothing direct, nothing he could put his finger on specifically, but in the last week there'd been a quality to her attention that made him uncomfortable. She'd mentioned Sandra Gaudo in passing, the way you might mention anyone you'd met at the diner, but the mention had landed on him like a small, cold weight. She'd asked about the Duplessis family once casually, and he'd answered casually, but afterwards he'd thought about it more than a casual question warranted. He was not a man who acted without cause. He needed to believe that, and largely he was correct. But he had been in this parish for 22 years, and he had learned that it was tidier to move problems out of his environment when they were still small. He had done it before. He would do it in the way he'd done it before: the evidence, the charge, the processing of someone through a system that was designed to process them and to be done with it. He hadn't searched her thoroughly enough. He knew that, sitting in his driveway. He'd found what he'd put there and moved to the arrest, which was the natural momentum of the situation, but he hadn't thought about what else she might be carrying or who she might be able to call. He'd told himself it was the name that had set him loose: Claire Thibodeau's, Louisiana name, Gulfport story, waitress job, barely running car. Everything about her said she had no more infrastructure than a woman who'd shown up with a duffel bag and a rent-and-cash arrangement. He trusted that calculation. He trusted it the way he trusted the calculations he'd been making for 22 years, and they had mostly been right, and so he'd stopped questioning them. He got out of the Tahoe and went inside his house. The lights were off. His wife, Renee, was asleep upstairs. He stood in the kitchen in the dark for a while, looking at nothing, and then he poured 3 inches of early Times over 2 ice cubes and sat at the kitchen table and drank it slowly. He was not a man who slept badly. He would sleep badly that night, though he didn't know it yet. By 5:30 in the morning, the Western District prosecutor, a woman named Elspeth Greer who had worked 3 years as a public defender before switching sides and who maintained, as a consequence, an unusually clear picture of how evidence could be manufactured, had signed off on a tactical approach in consultation with the DSAC and with Marcus Webb, and with a supervisor from the Criminal Investigative Division who had flown into Alexandria overnight. They were not moving yet. Moving too fast would compromise the integrity of the case, which was the case against Murchison for the frame-up, the planting of evidence, and not simply the case against him for the financial crimes and the prior incidents, which were significant but were less clean, less visible, less suitable for a federal prosecution that needed to carry a jury. What they had now that they hadn't had at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon was a living incident in progress. What they needed was documentation of that incident's construction, evidence of how the bag had arrived in the car, chain of custody from Murchison's possession to that Ziploc, and preferably something showing that the substance in the bag could be traced back to a seizure that had officially been logged as destroyed. Webb had 2 analysts working the evidence inventory database before 6 in the morning. At 6:42, one of them found it. Claire was arraigned before a magistrate at 8 in the morning. The magistrate was a woman named Delacroix who'd been handling first appearances in Caldwell Parish for 11 years, and who had, over those 11 years, developed the studied neutrality of someone who had seen enough to know that neutrality was the only self-preserving position in a small-town courthouse. She set bond at $5,000. She looked at Claire for a moment longer than standard, something that might have been appraisal or might have been recognition of something she couldn't name, and then she moved on to the next case on the docket. The court-appointed attorney was a man named Preston Fontenot, no relation, and Claire spent a moment appreciating the coincidence, who arrived 40 minutes late, smelling of cigarette smoke and the particular exhaustion of a man who had too many clients and too little time, and who had long since made his peace with the fact that he was not the version of a lawyer he'd imagined he'd be when he was 26. He sat beside her and flipped through the charge sheet and said, in a low voice, "You want to talk about a plea arrangement? I can probably get this down to a simple possession." She looked at him. "Let me think about it," she said. He looked up from the sheet. He had kind eyes, she noticed, tired but kind. "Okay," he said, "think about it." She was back in the holding cell by 9. Webb had told her in the coded language of the brother call the night before that the situation was being actively managed and that she should not take any action that would reveal her identity until she received a specific signal, which would come through legal channels in the form of a particular phrase. She'd understood. She sat on the bench and thought about Sandra Gaudo driving to the catfish plant on bad tires. Murchison came in at 10 for his regular shift. He was in the break room when the watch sergeant, a man named Hargrove who had 25 years in and was 13 months from retirement, and who would spend those 13 months trying to make himself as unobtrusive as possible, mentioned that the Thibodeaux woman from last night's booking had declined a plea conversation. Murchison poured his coffee. He said. "Preston thinks she might want to go to trial." Murchison looked at his coffee. "On what? 8 grams, she'll get a public defender who'll fold her in 2 weeks. Hargrove shrugged. He looked at Murchison for a half a second with an expression that wasn't quite anything definable, and then he looked away. "Probably," Hargrove said. Murchison took his coffee to his desk. He spent the morning on an unrelated livestock theft complaint that had been sitting in his queue for 2 weeks. He called the complainant, an elderly man named Arsenax who had lost 3 heifers and who believed his neighbor was responsible and who wanted Murchison to arrest the neighbor immediately. Murchison took notes. He told Mr. Arsenax he'd look into it. He was professional and patient and thorough, the way he was when he was working cases that weren't complicated, cases that didn't have weight on them, cases where he was simply a deputy doing what a deputy did, which was most of what he did. He ate lunch at his desk. He did not go to the Pelican. He told himself this was because he was busy. The evidence log from the Caldwell Parish property room, obtained under the federal subpoena that had been served on the property room supervisor at 7:45 that morning, served quietly, by a state investigator who had been briefed before dawn, who had presented the paperwork and taken the requested records and asked the supervisor, a man named Clovis Thuriot who was not implicated in anything, and who would turn out to be an unexpectedly precise and cooperative witness. To please not discuss this with anyone until contacted again, showed that Exhibit 14C from a March drug seizure, a quantity of methamphetamine originally logged at 11.4 grams and subsequently logged as partially field-tested and the remainder scheduled for destruction, had a discrepancy in its weight records. The lab test on the bag recovered from Claire's car would take 3 days. The preliminary field analysis run by Trosclair using a standard colorimetric kit had returned positive, but Trosclair had noted in his report that the substance had an unusual consistency, compressed. He'd written uniform density not consistent with street-level bagging. He'd noted it because he was thorough. He hadn't known why he was noting it. He'd noted it the way good deputies noted things, because things that seemed off were worth writing down even if you couldn't explain them yet. That note would matter. The substance, when formally tested, would come back as methamphetamine, consistent in chemical profile with Exhibit 14. See, a forensic chemist would prepare a report in which the statistical likelihood of a coincidental match between the 2 samples was so small as to be, in the chemist's precise and careful language, not consistent with independent sourcing. But that was 3 days away. For now, there was just the log, the discrepancy, and a federal team that was beginning to move like a system that had been waiting for the right pressure point and had just felt it. The signal came through Preston Fontenot at 2:15 on the afternoon of August 16th. He arrived at the holding area and sat across from her in the consultation room and put a yellow legal pad on the table and said, in the tone of a man reading from something he'd been told to read, "I received a call from an attorney in Alexandria who says he's been retained by your family and wants me to communicate that the blue folder has been transferred." She looked at the legal pad. She looked at Preston. "Okay," she said. "That means something to you." "Yeah, it does." "Okay," he looked at her with the tired, kind eyes. "You want to tell me what's happening?" She thought about it for a moment. she decided he'd earned something honest. "I'm not going to be in here much longer," she said. He studied her. She watched him work it out or begin to, the calm she'd maintained, the way she'd declined the plea without agitation, the call from the Alexandria attorney. She watched him reach a border he wasn't certain he wanted to cross and stop at it. "All right," he said finally. He picked up his legal pad. "You need anything else from me right now?" "No," she said, "thank you for real." He nodded. He went to the door and knocked twice and waited for it to open. Before it did, he turned back once. "I've had clients in here with bad paper," he said. "You don't look like them." She didn't say anything. He left. The arrest team assembled at the Caldwell Parish Regional Airport, which was less an airport than an airstrip with pretensions, in the early afternoon of August 17th. It was 7 vehicles. 2 FBI Tactical, 2 Louisiana State Police, 1 vehicle from the U.S. Marshals Service, and 2 nondescript Bureau sedans. A total of 14 personnel, in addition to 3 federal marshals who would execute a simultaneous search warrant at Murchison's home on Bayou Buff Road, and a second search warrant at the hunting camp registered to the LLC. Marcus Webb was there. He'd driven up from Alexandria that morning in a rented Camry with the air conditioning at maximum and a coffee that had gone cold in the cup holder. He was 44, trim, with close-cropped gray at his temples and the kind of unhurried manner that people who'd been in law enforcement for a long time either developed or learned to fake. He'd told the tactical team supervisor, an FBI SWAT coordinator named Briggs who had done this operation type 40 times, that the subject was smart, that he was almost certainly armed. He was a peace officer, he was always armed, and that the subject had 22 years of institutional knowledge of this parish and its geography, which meant they were not going to give him time to think. The arrest was going to happen at the substation. The substation, unlike a traffic stop or a home location, was a fixed, known environment where they could control approach vectors. And arresting a corrupt deputy inside his own department's building in front of his colleagues was a tactical calculation with consequences beyond the tactical. It was a declaration, visible and irreversible, that what had happened here could not be quietly resolved. Elspeth Greer had made that call. Webb agreed with it. It would be harder on the other deputies in that building. But there was a woman who drove on bad tires to a catfish plant because of what had happened in that building, and Webb thought about that when the calculus got complicated. They moved at 3:45. The parking lot of the Caldwell Parish Sheriff's substation on Rue Prudhomme was not designed for 7 vehicles, and the arrival of the convoy was not quiet. 2 tactical vehicles went in through the front entrance. 2 state police units covered the rear exit. The sedans pulled in behind the tactical vehicles with their emergency lights off. There had been a deliberate decision not to run lights, to keep the approach as contained as possible for as long as possible. It lasted approximately 40 seconds. Webb was in the second sedan. He got out and walked toward the building with the kind of unhurried pace that people sometimes mistook for casualness, and that was actually the gait of someone who has done the math and knows where they stand. The duty sergeant at the front desk, a man named Kyasin who would later describe the experience at length to his wife and his pastor and eventually a newspaper reporter, looked up from his computer at a room that had suddenly acquired 14 armed people and a great deal of focused silence, and he said, "What the?" and stopped. Webb put his credentials on the desk. "Senior Deputy Dale Murchison," he said. "Is he in the building?" Kyasin looked at the credentials. He looked at the room. He was a middle-aged man with a mortgage and a daughter in college and no particular desire to be remembered in any context, and he said, he's in the back, second office on the left." "Thank you," Webb said. Briggs already had 2 tactical personnel moving toward the corridor. Murchison was at his desk when they came through the door. He had a report open on his computer. He was wearing his reading glasses, which he hated wearing in front of people because he'd resisted them for 2 years before his optometrist made him understand he had no choice. The glasses were on a croquis around his neck when he wasn't wearing them, and he would later think in the months that followed about the fact that he'd been wearing them when they came through the door. He didn't know why that detail stuck with him. It just did. He did not go for his weapon. This was important, and it was the thing that people who knew him would mention afterwards, some in admiration and some in acknowledgement of something cooler and more calculating. He assessed the room in the first half-second and did not go for his weapon because he understood immediately that the room was not survivable in that way. And because some part of him, the part that had spent 22 years being sharp, being careful, being the man in the room who saw things before other people saw them, had been waiting for this, or something shaped like this, since at least 3 in the morning on August 16th. He took off his glasses. "Dale Murchison," Briggs said, "FBI federal warrant for your arrest." He looked at Briggs. He looked at the others behind Briggs. He looked at last at Marcus Webb in the doorway, who was standing with his hands in the pockets of his jacket and watching him with an expression that was neither triumphant nor sympathetic, just professionally attentive, the expression of a man doing a job he's done before. He looked for a long moment at Webb. Then he stood up slowly, the way you stand when your back hurts, and he put his hands out in front of him. In a thing that felt both deliberate and accidental, the hallway was occupied by 5 other deputies when they brought him through it. Kayassin was there. Fontenville, the young deputy who'd shifted his weight in 8-second cycles, was there. Hargrove, 13 months from retirement, was at the far end by the break room door with a coffee cup in his hand, and he looked at Murchison with an expression that Murchison could not read. He had always been able to read Hargrove, and the coffee cup in Hargrove's hand was very still. They put him in the back of a federal vehicle. Trosclair was in the parking lot when they came out. He was just back from a call, still in his car with the door open, and he sat there with one boot on the ground and looked at Murchison in the back of the federal vehicle, and something crossed Trosclair's face that wasn't quite anything, the way the shadow of a cloud crosses a field, fast and without definition, and then he looked away. The interrogation was conducted at the FBI's temporary operations space in a conference room of a motor inn in Opelousas, neutral ground, away from the parish, which was both a practical and a symbolic choice that Greer and Webb had discussed. The room had a table and 4 chairs and a camera on a tripod in the corner, and a window covered by blackout curtains, because the afternoon light was aggressive enough to affect the camera exposure. Murchison had declined to answer questions until he had an attorney. This was entirely his right, and he exercised it without drama, statting at once and then sitting back and folding his hands on the table. His attorney arrived at 7:15, a criminal defense lawyer from Baton Rouge named Elkins who was expensive and good, and who spent 20 minutes with his client before entering the room and signaling that they were prepared to have a limited conversation about the matter at hand. What followed was not a confession. It was a series of responses to specific questions, most of which were variants of "I don't recall" or "I'd have to review the record," delivered in a flat, controlled register that had been trained into Murchison by 22 years of working in a system where you never said more than you had to. Elkins interjected occasionally, efficiently, without theater. Webb asked about the evidence log from March. Murchison said he'd have to see the specific document. Webb put the specific document in front of him. Murchison looked at it for a long moment. "I don't recall this log," he said. "You signed it," Webb said. Murchison looked at his signature at the bottom of the log. He looked at it for a while. He was not a man who exhibited obvious tells, but he touched the corner of the document once lightly with one finger, a single brief contact, barely perceptible, and then moved his hand back to the folded position. "I'd need to consult with my attorney about the context of this document," he said. Webb let the silence sit. It sat for a while. "Mr. Murchison," Webb said eventually, "the woman you arrested on August 15th, Claire Thibodeaux." Murchison said nothing. "That name mean anything to you?" "She's the subject of an open case." "Open," Webb said. He nodded as though considering this. "The case is closed, Mr. Murchison. It was dismissed this morning, all charges." Murchison's hands remained folded on the table. "That name," Webb said again, "Claire Thibodeaux, you know anything about her beyond what you put in the arrest report?" "No." Webb opened the folder in front of him and slid a photograph across the table. It was a bureau photo, official badge number visible, the kind taken at Quantico. The woman in the photograph had a different haircut and was wearing a jacket and was looking at the camera with an expression that was not the expression she'd worn for 6 weeks at the Pelican Diner, but the face was the face. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Something moved in his expression. It was not quite shock, he was too controlled for shock, or shock was too blunt a word for it. It was more like a man watching a wall he'd been leaning on for 22 years develop in one sudden visible instant an irremediable crack. He looked up from the photograph at Webb. Webb waited. Murchison looked back at the photograph. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was a man who had been sharp for 22 years, and he knew it, and he understood with a totality that precluded any remaining negotiations with the facts exactly what the photograph meant and what it had cost him. Not remorse, it was too early and too clear-eyed for remorse, more like an audit. The ledger open, the numbers not working. The thing you'd known somewhere in the basement of yourself for years that you couldn't afford to look at directly and now had no choice. Elkins said they needed a break. Webb said of course. The arraignment on federal charges was set for September 4th in the Western District of Louisiana Courthouse in Alexandria. The charges were at that filing 11 counts. 2 counts of civil rights violations under color of law, 3 counts of evidence tampering, 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law relating specifically to the Sandra Gaudo matter, which the investigation had now formally opened as a separate incident, 2 counts related to financial crimes connected to the seized asset records and the LLC, and 3 additional counts that the grand jury had generated from the ongoing investigation that continued to develop after the arrest. There would eventually be more. The final indictment filed in February ran to 23 counts. The Caldwell Parish sheriff issued a public statement the evening of the arrest expressing shock and reiterating the department's commitment to integrity, which is the statement that is always issued in these circumstances, and which means whatever the person hearing it needs it to mean. 3 national outlets picked up the story on August 18th. It ran at a moderate volume for 4 days, long enough to be noticed, not long enough to fundamentally alter the median American's mental model of how small-town law enforcement worked, which required a different kind of media metabolism than a single story possessed. Lavinia Duplessis, Terrence's mother, saw the coverage on the local evening news while she was folding laundry in her living room. She sat down on the couch with a towel in her hands and watched the segment, which was 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and then she called her sister. She didn't cry, the sister would later say. She just said, "I told you, I told every one of you." Sandra Gaudo saw it on her phone on a break at the catfish plant. She read the story twice. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work and didn't say anything to anyone. The drive home at midnight was the same as every other drive home, the same bad roads, the same 2 tires that needed replacing, the same radio station that faded in and out when the signal dropped. The kids were at their grandmother's for the week. The house was empty when she got in. She sat at her kitchen table for a while. The story wasn't hers exactly. Hers was its own thing, separate, still unresolved, still in the process of being filed and refiled and entered into the record. The legal process was exactly as slow and uncertain as it had always been. Nobody had promised her anything because promises in this arena were a form of cruelty. But she sat at the table for a while. Claire Thibodeaux, who was not Claire Thibodeaux, who had a real name she'd been using again since August 16th, who had filed her operational debrief in Alexandria over 2 days, and then taken 3 days of personal leave in New Orleans, and spent most of it in a rental on Magazine Street watching cable, and eating Vietnamese takeout, and trying to remember what it felt like to be herself without concentration, was reassigned to the New Orleans field office in September. Pending the evidentiary phase of the Murchison prosecution in which she would serve as a primary witness. She had given exactly 1 interview about the case, to an internal review board, and had answered each question completely and without elaboration. She had been offered a commendation, which she neither sought nor declined, simply accepted with the equanimity of someone who had learned that recognition in this work was a currency that spent quickly and accumulated at a rate not worth tracking. She ran into Marcus Webb at the coffee machine in the New Orleans field office on a Tuesday morning in October. He was in a good mood, not because of Murchison, or not only, but because his daughter had gotten into a program in Austin she'd wanted badly. He told Claire about it while they waited for the machine to finish its cycle. She said that was great, she meant it. He handed her her cup. "You doing okay?" he said. She thought about it for a moment, which was more than the question usually required but which Webb noticed and didn't comment on. "Yeah," she said, "mostly." He nodded. He didn't ask what the mostly was carrying. He'd been in this long enough to know that some of what you carried from a case was the result of the bad things that had happened, and some of it was the result of the fact that the good things, the right things, the things the work was supposed to produce had a weight to them too, and that weight was not always comfortable, and that the people who found it comfortable were not always the people you most wanted doing the work. She took her coffee back to her desk. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, the noise of it coming up through the walls, the smell of it in the air conditioning, the particular quality of light that New Orleans manufactured in October, low and golden and oddly sad. She had a deposition prep at 10 and a call with Elspeth Greer at 2 about a specific point in the timeline that needed clarification before the preliminary hearing. She opened her laptop. On the desk beside it, where she'd set it down when she came in, was the court-issued copy of Murchison's arraignment record, marked with a yellow sticky tab at page 4 where his name appeared in the formal charging language in the way that names appeared in those documents, reduced to print, stripped of everything that had made him dangerous and real and human and capable of what he'd done. Just a name in a column among other names, in a document that would live in a federal archive for 30 years. She didn't look at it again. She opened her work. The hearing, when it came, was in a courtroom on the second floor of the federal building in Alexandria, a room with high ceilings and the particular hush of a place where things that could not be undone were formally acknowledged. Murchison sat at the defense table in a dark suit he'd owned since his nephew's wedding, which was 4 years ago, and which was slightly tight across the shoulders in a way that was not comfortable, and which there was nothing to be done about. He was 50 years old. He'd looked in the weeks since the arrest as though he'd aged past it, not dramatically, not in the way of a movie, but in the way of a man who had been sleeping badly and who had stopped going to the gym, and who was carrying a weight that had no external visibility but was evident in the set of the shoulders, and the particular quality of stillness that came over a person who had run out of things to project. Renee was not in the courtroom. She had moved to her sister's house in Lafayette 6 weeks after the arrest. She had not filed for divorce yet. She had not said she wouldn't. She'd told Dale, in the last conversation they'd had that went beyond logistics, that she needed time to understand what it was that she hadn't known, and whether the not knowing was the result of her own failure to look or his success at concealing it. And that until she understood that, she couldn't be in a room with him without feeling like she was standing in a space where the floor might not hold. He'd told her he understood. He didn't fully, but he understood enough. His attorney had negotiated hard. The prosecution had the evidence, but prosecutions always balanced what they had against what they could prove to a jury that might forgive a cop for complicated reasons. Greer was a good prosecutor and she was confident, but she was not arrogant, and her confidence existed alongside a precise and experienced knowledge of how juries could work. They talked about a cooperation agreement which Murchison had ultimately declined because cooperation meant implicating people, and there was a version of Dale Murchison, diminished, accountable, standing in a suit that didn't fit, who still would not do that. Whether this was loyalty or the last remnant of a self-image that had survived everything else, even Elkins couldn't quite tell. He entered his pleas. The room was not full. These hearings rarely were. There were few reporters in the gallery, local, one regional. There was a woman from the sheriff's department, not a deputy but an administrative coordinator named Teresa, who had worked in the Caldwell Parish system for 16 years and who had come, she told people afterwards, because she felt she needed to witness it, though she couldn't have explained exactly what she meant by that. In the second row of the gallery, Lavinia Duplessis sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and watched with an expression that was not satisfaction and was not grief and was not relief, but was something that existed alongside all three without being reducible to any of them. She had taken half a day from work. Her supervisor had asked no questions when she said she needed the time. Claire was not in the courtroom. Her testimony had been submitted as part of the evidentiary record, and her role in the proceedings would require her presence at trial, not at the hearing. She was in the New Orleans field office when the hearing happened, 3 hours away, working on a different matter entirely, a financial fraud case, dry and documentary, and requiring the kind of close reading that left no room for other thoughts. She found out the plea had been entered when Webb sent her a single text message at 2:47 in the afternoon. She read it. She set the phone face down on her desk. She went back to the document she'd been reading. Outside the window, the city moved through its afternoon, indifferent and continuous and full of the ordinary noise of people going about their lives, which was, when you stayed in this work long enough, both the thing that made it worth it and the thing that made it hard, the sheer continuity of it. The way the world kept going at the same pace regardless of what happened in the rooms where things were decided, the way justice, when it arrived not as a resolution but as a single event in a long, unfinished story that kept moving before and after you regardless of what you'd done or hadn't done, or still needed to do. She turned to the next page. The document was dense and specific and required her full attention, and she gave it her full attention, and the afternoon light moved across her desk, and the city outside kept going, and she kept going with it. In Caldwell Parish, fall arrived the way it always did, late, reluctant, the heat finally releasing its grip sometime in October after months of warning that it wouldn't. The live oaks dropped a small quantity of their leaves, and the light shifted by 4 degrees to the south, and the air thinned fractionally. You had to know what you were looking for to see it. Most people who'd lived there long enough knew. The Pelican Diner got a new waitress. She was younger than Claire had been, from somewhere in Arkansas, and she remembered orders precisely and had a quick, dry sense of humor that the regulars appreciated. Within 2 weeks, she knew everyone's name. Darnell's foot was worse in the cool weather. He kept a small space heater under the prep table and worked around it and didn't complain because he never had and wasn't going to start. The bass boat sat on its trailer behind the house on Bayou Buff Road, under a canvas cover that Renee had not taken with her because it hadn't occurred to her, or because she hadn't wanted it. The property had been seized pending the forfeiture proceedings, and there was a laminated notice on the door. The boat would eventually be sold at auction. The proceeds would go to the Department of Justice's Asset Forfeiture Fund, from which a portion would be allocated to the parish's victim compensation account, which Sandra Gaudo's attorney was already in contact with. The Spanish moss still hung from the live oaks on the highway. The humidity still collected in the low places where the land couldn't decide what it was. The stars came out hard and clear on the cold nights, the way they only came out in places with no money for enough streetlights, which was a beauty that existed only because of an absence, the way some things did. The door of the substation was propped open in the evenings to let the heat out. It looked the same from the outside as it always had. Most things did.